One thing that was good, he never changed his feelings about people or about anything, really, you know. I'm sure he was very happy with his success.
They say the body gives warnings before it quits, but nobody was really listening to Vernon Presley anymore. 72 hours before his heart finally gave out, he was sitting in that familiar chair, the same house, the same phone on the table. But everything felt heavier. His breathing, his thoughts, the silence. The man who once stood beside the king of rock and roll now looked like he was carrying a kingdom on his back. And he knew he was running out of time. This wasn't just age catching up with him. It was something else. Something colder. Vernon had seen too many hospital rooms, too many white sheets, too many doctors explaining things in words that never made the pain any easier. First his wife, then his son. He knew what it looked like when a life was being counted in days instead of years. And now, for the first time, he felt that same countdown inside his own chest. Every beat felt like a question. What happens to Elvis's world when I'm gone? On the small table in front of him wasn't a photo album or a stack of fan letters. It was paperwork. Thick, ugly, complicated paperwork. Numbers, debts, taxes, contracts. Lines that said, "Due immediately." Columns that didn't care that the name at the top was Elvis Presley. The truth hidden in those pages was brutal. The empire Elvis built was bleeding. The house that fans dreamed of, Graceland, was no golden palace on paper. It was a money pit. The bills to maintain it, the staff, the security, the taxes, it was all crushing down. And the touring stopped the day Elvis did. The cash didn't flow like it used to. The world saw a mansion on a hill. Vernon saw a ticking bomb. He flipped another page, his fingers trembling just enough for him to notice. If he did nothing, if he simply sat there and waited for his heart to decide the rest, there might be almost nothing left for the one person Elvis had loved more than the music, more than the spotlight, more than Graceland itself, Lisa Marie. That thought hit harder than any chest pain. Because behind all the contracts and legal terms, that's what these 72 hours were really about. A grandfather, already shattered by losing his son, staring down the possibility that his granddaughter could inherit nothing but problems and memories. Vernon remembered Elvis as a little boy in Tupelo, then as a young man buying Graceland, so proud he could finally give his parents a home that felt like a miracle. He remembered the way Elvis hugged him after shows, exhausted but glowing, asking, "We okay, Daddy? Everything good?" And Vernon would answer, "Yeah, son, we're good." Now he wasn't sure he could say that anymore. The cruel part was this. The world thought Elvis's death was the end of the story. The music stopped, the news broke, the crowds cried, and the headlines moved on. But for Vernon, that's when the real nightmare began. Lawyers, accountants, courts, people he barely knew suddenly very interested in Elvis's name, Elvis's money, Elvis's future. And every one of them had a different idea about what should happen next. Vernon's chest tightened again. He knew the doctors would call it stress. They always did. But this didn't feel like normal worry. This felt like his body was warning him. You don't have long. Decide something. He wasn't just Elvis's daddy anymore. On paper, he was the executor, the trustee, the man in charge, the one person Elvis had trusted to juggle all of this if the unthinkable ever happened. And the unthinkable had happened years ago. Vernon had been juggling grief and paperwork ever since, and now the balls were starting to drop. There's a different kind of fear that comes when you realize you won't be around to clean up the mess you leave behind. He picked up a pen, then put it down again. The hardest part wasn't accepting that his own time was almost up. He could feel that in his bones. The hardest part was choosing who would step into the fire after him, who would be strong enough and stubborn enough to fight for Elvis's name when he no longer could. The house was quiet, but his mind was loud. Memories of Gladys, of Elvis, of that awful day when he stood in front of cameras and told the world his son was gone. The weight of those words never left him. It had followed him into every night since. It was following him now. The papers in front of him weren't just legal documents. They were a crossroads. If he chose wrong, the Presley legacy could be torn apart by lawsuits, greed, bad management, and strangers picking at Elvis's memory like vultures. If he chose right, maybe, just maybe, Graceland would still be standing, the estate saved, and Lisa Marie protected long after his own heart stopped. Another sharp thump in his chest. Another reminder. In those final 72 hours, Vernon Presley wasn't just an old man fading away. He was a father and grandfather staring down the most important decision of his life. A decision he knew he had to make before the clock ran out. And when he finally decided who would hold Elvis's future after him, it wasn't a choice everyone in the Presley circle agreed with. They say when a man is close to the end, his mind doesn't stay in the present anymore. It wanders backward to the moments that broke him. Before Vernon could sign anything, before he could put a name on those papers and hand away Elvis's future, the ghosts of his past came back for him. And almost all of them lived inside the walls of Graceland. In those last days, his thoughts kept dragging him back to one date he never escaped. August 16th, 1977. He could still hear the sound of his own voice, raw and shaking, telling the world, "My son, Elvis, is dead." Cameras in his face, microphones shoved forward, strangers crying as if they knew his boy the way he did. The world watched a moment of history. Vernon lived a moment of collapse. The truth was, a part of him never got back up from that day. But if you rewind even further, the pattern had started long before Elvis. Vernon had already stood by one grave that shattered him, Gladys Presley's. He'd watched his wife's health spiral, watched his son almost crumble with her. Elvis used to say his mama was his whole world. Vernon knew what it did to a boy to lose that world. And he knew what it did to a husband to bury his wife. So by the time Elvis died, Vernon wasn't just grieving a son. He was reliving the loss of his wife. And somewhere deep down, he knew he was next in line. In those final 72 hours, that grief didn't fade. It grew teeth. He walked through rooms that still smelled like Elvis's life. The den, the music room, the places where his boy once laughed, rehearsed, told jokes between bites of food at 3 a.m. To the fans, Graceland was magic. To Vernon, it was a house filled with echoes that never let him rest. Every hallway whispered questions. Could you have protected him better? Should you have pushed back harder? Said no more often? Pulled him off the road? Found a way to stop the pills? No doctor's report ever answered those questions. No business meeting quieted them. They were louder at night when the crowds were gone, and the idea of Elvis Presley turned back into the memory of a boy from Tupelo who used to fall asleep on his daddy's shoulder. A father is built to protect. But now Vernon was staring at the reality that he hadn't been able to protect Elvis from the world. and he might not be able to protect Elvis's world from what came next. The estate was a mess. That wasn't gossip, that was fact. He kept hearing the same warnings. The money was running out, the taxes were brutal, the estate couldn't just sit there frozen in time. And then came the ugliest whisper of all, the one that made his stomach twist every time he heard it. To the outside world, Priscilla Presley was the ex-wife, the beautiful woman in the photos, the love story that didn't last, the one the tabloids liked to gossip about. But to Vernon, in those final hours, she was something much more important. The mother of Elvis's only child, and one of the few people who truly understood what Elvis had built and what it meant. She had seen the chaos up close. She knew the pressures. And unlike most people around the estate, she wasn't interested in clinging to the past if it meant losing the future. So Vernon made a choice that would echo for decades. He arranged for Priscilla, along with trusted professionals, an accountant who knew the estate inside out, and a bank that could handle the financial machinery, to take over as executors and trustees after he was gone. He spread the responsibility between heart and expertise, someone who loved Elvis and people who understood the cold numbers. Inside some corners of the Presley circle, this move stirred quiet tension. Not everyone liked the idea of Priscilla stepping into that kind of power. Some felt the ex-wife shouldn't be at the helm of Elvis's empire. Others worried it meant a new direction that would leave old loyalties behind. For certain longtime insiders, it felt like the ground shifting under their feet. But Vernon wasn't thinking about their comfort. He was thinking about walking past Lisa Marie's room and knowing that when he was buried next to his son, she wouldn't be left alone with a broken estate and a crumbling house. He was thinking about Elvis's memory being protected not just by nostalgia, but by strategy. In that sense, his decision wasn't just practical, it was an act of love. Because what came later, the transformation of a nearly broke estate into a global empire, the opening of Graceland to fans, the careful protecting of Elvis's image, all of that started with Vernon choosing, in his weakened state, to hand over power to someone willing to fight like a mother, not just manage like a manager. He didn't live to see the full impact. He didn't see the tours, the lines at the gate, or the financial turnaround. He only knew one thing. If Elvis trusted him, then his last duty was to decide who would be trusted after him. With a tired hand and a heart that knew it was close to its final beat, Vernon Presley set his signature. In ink, it looked small. On the Presley legacy, it was massive. But as heavy as that decision was, it still didn't silence the storm inside him. Because even after choosing who would guard Elvis's empire, Vernon was still haunted by one truth. He could pass on the power. He could not pass on the pain. They wrote heart attack on the paperwork like it was a simple thing. But hearts don't just stop. They wear down. They crack. They carry too much. They break long before the final beat. And for Vernon Presley, that breaking started long before his last day on earth. In those final 24 hours, the house around him looked quiet from the outside. No sirens, no flashing lights, no screaming headlines. Just another day in the life of a man the world rarely thought about unless he was standing next to his son. But inside his chest, the war was almost over. His body was tired. Years of stress had sat on his shoulders like concrete. He'd buried his wife. He'd buried his son. He'd watched lawyers circle Elvis's estate like sharks searching for blood in the water. He'd listened to warnings about foreclosure, taxes, and bankruptcy until the words didn't even sound real anymore. He'd made his choice about the future. He had signed what he needed to sign. He had passed the torch to the people he believed could keep Elvis's world from collapsing. On paper, the problem was handled. But you can't sign away grief. Even after he put that pen down for the last time, the question still whispered in the dark corners of his mind. Did I do enough for my boy? Did I protect him from the wrong people? Did I miss the moment when I could have saved him? Those aren't questions a doctor can treat. The truth is, what really killed Vernon wasn't just a failing heart. It was the years leading up to it. The endless worry over the estate, the fear of losing Graceland, the image of Elvis on that final day, the sound of his own voice declaring his son dead to the world. You can feel your own body failing. You know when you're not coming back from the kind of exhaustion that lives in your bones. And Vernon felt it. But he also felt something else. A strange, fragile peace. Because for the first time since Elvis died, there was a plan that didn't end with a for sale sign on the front lawn of Graceland. There was a path where Lisa Marie wouldn't grow up hearing that her father's home had been lost, that his estate had crumbled, that his name had been sold off to the highest bidder. He couldn't fix the past. He couldn't bring Elvis back. He couldn't go back to those moments when maybe, just maybe, one different choice could have changed the ending. But he could do this one thing: make sure his granddaughter still had a future built on more than just a famous last name. That's the part the headlines never write about. They mention dates and causes, list the age, summarize the man as Elvis Presley's father, Vernon, who died of heart trouble a few years after his son. They turn a lifetime of loyalty, struggle, mistakes, and sacrifice into one neat sentence. But you and I both know the truth of it is much heavier. He died from loving people who were constantly in the line of fire. He died from carrying an empire he never asked to rule. He died from standing between Elvis's memory and a world that never stopped wanting more. And yet, if you look at what happened after his death, you can see the fingerprints of his final decision everywhere. Graceland didn't vanish into a bank's portfolio. It became a place fans could walk through, cry in, and feel close to Elvis again. Elvis's estate didn't disappear. It was rebuilt, restructured, and turned into something strong enough to outlive not just Elvis, but Vernon and even the generation after them. Vernon didn't live to see that. He didn't see the lines of fans at the gates, the tours, the way Elvis's legacy would grow into a global force long after the last original Presley drew his final breath. He didn't see Lisa Marie grow up with a legacy that, for all its pain, still had a foundation beneath it. But all of that traces back to a tired father in failing health, choosing protection over pride in his last stretch of time. So when people say he died of a heart attack, you might nod, but now you know better. You know that by the time his heart stopped, it had already been breaking for years. You know that behind that medical phrase was a story about love, regret, duty, and one last act of courage. And maybe the next time you hear the name Vernon Presley, you won't just picture the man standing slightly behind Elvis in old photos. You'll remember the father who, in the last 72 hours of his life, did everything he could to make sure his son's world didn't die with him. He's now resting near the son and the wife he loved, surrounded by the land they once dreamed about when they were poor and unknown. The crowds come and go, the candles burn and fade, the tours end, and the gates close each night. But the promise he tried to keep? That's still alive. And maybe that's the real measure of a man whose heart finally gave out, but never fully let go. If you're still here, it means you don't just love Elvis the legend. You care about the people who carried his pain. If you want more untold Presley stories like this, tap subscribe, hit like, and tell me in the comments which hidden chapter of this family you want next.